Happy Halloween, everybody, and welcome to Back Away Slowly. As most of you know, we walk through the mysterious places, explore ominous folktales, and seek out strange creatures. We try to understand how these stories came to be, the effects they had on history, and still have on culture. All sources, social links, and more are available at backawayslowlypodcast.com. A warning that serious themes and language are used, so viewer discretion is advised. Our last topic was pretty intense, so I'm scrolling through my lists to find our next creature. Well, this one has a decently long history to it, and a weird history at that. While this cryptid's pretty well known, some of these sightings and incidents are just too wild to pass up. This file's a lot bigger than I anticipated, but the Jersey Devil it is. So remember, there will be more after Halloween for those of you like me who really hate to see this holiday come and go. But first, we should probably understand the environment and cultural history of its home. I myself have only traveled as far northeast as Pennsylvania, so I could use a bit of a crash course on the mysterious and incredibly unique Pine Barrens. It was 10,000 years ago when humans first entered the Pinelands, a near inhospitable tundra at the time. But it seems to be part of human nature to take on conditions like these, almost as a sort of challenge. The first indigenous people of the area managed to adjust their lives to withstand the harsh conditions, settling near small ponds, foraging berries, and hunting game. Over time, the area warmed up and sea levels rose. Eventually, the land and climate shifted to what you'd see today if you decided to visit. The area's main indigenous group is the Lenni Lenape, a gentle, peace-loving community along the northeastern seaboard of the United States. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation website reads, quote, often keeping the peace and mediating disputes between our neighboring native nations, and were admired by European colonists for our hospitality and mediation skills. Speaking of those European colonists, they began to arrive in bulk in the early 1600s. This was disastrous for an unfortunately common reason: smallpox. While the disease was dangerous to Europeans, it was devastating to the indigenous populations, to whom smallpox was a brand new, horrifying experience. There was no respite for these benign people, as in 1758, a treaty with the British took much of the Lenape's land from them. The Pinelands Preservation Alliance website reads, quote, a reservation called the Brotherton Reservation was established for Lenape people in what is now Indian Mills, but the reservation never became self-sufficient, and most of the tribe relocated to upstate New York in 1802, marking a sad end to significant Lenape settlement and culture in the Pinelands. Early Europeans settled in coastal towns, its citizens making a living in timber-based trades like shipbuilding. Soon the shorelines were teeming with the Swedes, the Dutch, the English, and other northern Europeans. Despite this successful foothold of European civilization, they hit a bit of a snag. As they cleared the land of trees and undergrowth, the settlers found a sandy soil that rejected the crops that the settlers were familiar with. This was the birth of the name the Pine Barrens. Despite its inhospitable soil, the settlers were happy to continue harvesting the timber along waterways. In 1765, the first furnaces and forges were built to utilize the bog iron deposits, which started to push settlements deeper into the mysterious pines. While the sandy soil might not have supported their preferred crops, all that sand was good for something: glass. Even when glass production faded, other rural industries popped up, such as charcoal production, iron production, paper milling, and others. Railroads were constructed in the mid-19th century. Eventually, they figured out what did grow in the Barrens. Berry harvesting became its own attraction, growing Pinelands produce like cranberries, blueberries, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, apples, peaches, and strawberries. Resorts were built along the shore, accessible by the new railroads. Past the colonization period, the Pinelands were further developed by Baymen, English Quakers, African Americans, Germans, Italians, Jews, Puerto Ricans, and Russians, all of whom are present in the region today in varying degrees. Over time, industries such as timber harvesting and bog iron production died out. The discovery of better iron ore in the West would shrink the Pine Barrens businesses, leaving behind eerie ghost towns. Life for those left in the Pine Barrens wasn't an easy one. Their days consisted of long hours and low pay. And as these industries crashed, the area sank deeper and deeper into poverty. Those who eked out a living in the Barrens were nicknamed Pineys, or pine rats, and not exactly in an endearing way. Seasonal jobs provided a much-needed boost to the locals, including cranberry and blueberry picking. Around Christmas, they would gather laurel, holly, and pine cones. But when those seasons passed, they would have to rely on collecting moss, picking wildflowers, making charcoal, and gathering wood. But these jobs could barely sustain anyone, let alone families. The locals' homes were sometimes no more than a tent or a lean-to. What towns were left began to crumble, and the Barrens were mostly abandoned once again. As more roads were constructed in the 20th century, this new accessibility allowed some more stable jobs to re-enter the area. But as author Schlosser notes, quote, "From an economic viewpoint, the lot of the people of the Pines began to improve. But the old-timers, and some of the young people, watched in dismay as modern civilization nibbled away the edges of their extraordinary wilderness." Today, the over 1.1 million acres of the Pinelands National Reserve, which is 22% of the state's total land, is the home of over 600,000 people. Although this land contains forest, wetlands, estuaries, towns, and suburbs, 2/3 of the area are protected from development. So if you were to visit the Pine Barrens today, what would it look like? What's interesting is that it's not just a massive uniform forest. It has diverse vegetation, animal species, and terrains. Now, I'm not going to read you all of the flora and fauna of the Barrens, but I'll briefly describe the areas, since I do think it gives important context. A small window to the surroundings that could be influencing these witnesses' sightings. The Pygmy Pine Plains have stretches of white sand barrens, lacking trees higher than your knees. These sections mostly contain bearberry and teaberry shrubs, lichen, and moss. Part of the reason for this lack of sizable plant life is that these plains have particularly poor soil and are subject to droughts. The area's plateaus are higher than the rest of its surroundings, and therefore are impacted by high winds. Because of these droughts, these plains experience wildfires twice as much as any other forest in the Pine Barrens. The Atlantic white cedar swamps are cool and shady, covered in moss. Where the Pygmy Pine Plains were near arid, the Atlantic white cedar swamps make up for the plains with high-bush blueberries, swamp magnolias, orchids, wildflowers, and a variety of animals. The pitch pine lowlands are wetlands, mostly made up of pitch pine trees. The hardwood swamps are also wetland forests, populated by swamp maple, black gum, and sweet gum trees. But the ground isn't desolate here. It's covered in high-bush blueberries, dangleberries, sweet pepperbush, and leatherleaf. This environment is particularly favored by large birds, such as barred owls and red-shouldered hawks. There are also savannahs in the Pine Barrens, the West Meadows, which are almost completely devoid of trees. These wide expanses of emptiness may not be around for long, though, as these patches of open ground are slowly being overtaken by the forest. Among most of these forests, swamps, and savannas are a good number of aquatic habitats. Rivers and streams in the Pine Barrens flow east to estuaries and bays that eventually lead to the Atlantic. However, these streams in particular are influenced by the barren soil, making them highly acidic with few nutrients. And lastly, vernal pools are scattered about, which are shallow depressions that dip near the water table, filling with water in the fall, winter, and early spring, only to dry up in the late spring and summer. Despite being temporary, these pools are vital to rare plant and animal life. Any larger lakes are the result of humans damming streams for the use of sawmills and grist mills. Today, those large ponds and lakes are used to grow cranberries and blueberries. Predictably, the area lost its black bears, cougars, and wolves from hunting and trapping, though the occasional black bear is spotted raiding the region's berry patches. However, the area still supports deer, coyotes, bobcats, beavers, red and gray foxes, minks, weasels, lemmings, bats, reclusive river otters, and more. The barrens are vital to the life cycle of many bird species like ducks, geese, eagles, hawks, and ospreys. You may even spot the occasional Pine Barrens tree frog, a green frog, or the southern leopard frog. There are a few species of snakes and a decent number of fish. However, the acidity of the water and high iron concentration limits the reproduction of most fish species. From the long stretches of sand, to the scrawny bushes and shrubs, to the swamps, the Pine Barrens name is deceptive. It may not have the forests and fields that you and I are used to, but it's full of some really beautiful life. Despite this, many who visit the area describe an uneasy feeling when they travel through the Pine Barrens. It's so alien, and a staggering amount of people immediately feel like something's watching them as soon as they enter. So what exactly do people think is watching them? Well, the origins of that story are a tangled web of knotted roots, but I'll do my best to walk you through it. The most common year given as the birth date of the Jersey Devil is 1735. I say the most common year because there are so many variations to this origin story that I had to filter a lot of them out, usually because they're just shadowy copies of each other. I'll give you the general notes of the main story, and then we'll explore some of the more interesting deviations. The story goes that Mrs. Leeds of Leeds Point is beyond exasperated when she learns that she's pregnant. Again. Some stories claim that this child is her 6th. Some say it's her 8th. Yet others say it's her 10th, or maybe the 12th. But the 13th is the most popular belief. Pushed past her limits, she cries out some variation of, quote, "Fine, let it be a devil." The night that the baby insists on being born is dark, thunderclouds swirling overhead. A clique of tittering midwives gather around Mrs. Leeds. As rain hammers on the window panes, Mrs. Leeds screams and screams. But for her labors, she's given a human baby. At first. The midwives and assistants gasp in terror as the baby begins to writhe, morphing into a monster. Most versions say that the world's most hideous baby then beat all present to death with its tail, before fleeing up the chimney and away into the night. Now, those are the most bare bones of the story, because every single detail seems to have some kind of variation. The easiest way to cover all of these versions is by starting back at the beginning and to pick through the story more carefully. So let's start with the actual main character of this story, the mother. Mrs. Leeds herself alternates between exhausted and usually reasonably frustrated mother to a rumored witch. The May issue of Atlantic Monthly in 1859 said that in 1735, a Mrs. Leeds of Burlington was suspected of not only witchcraft, but of having intimate relations with the devil himself. This unholy coupling created predictable results. After the Jersey Devil's escape, quote, "Little children he devoured, maidens he abused, young men he mauled and battered." A man named Reverend Henry Charlton Beck is going to be mentioned a few times in these episodes, and a good deal of his writings were part of my research. Beck was an author, a journalist, historian, folklorist, and minister. He traveled around to as many forgotten towns of New Jersey as possible, talking to anyone he could about their regional folklore. This is relevant because he found an elderly woman named Mrs. Bowen, who insisted that the monster's mother was Mrs. Shord, not Mrs. Leeds. But Mrs. Bowen had more than just words for Reverend Beck. She took him into the woods, beating their way through the underbrush to the remains of a cellar of a long-gone house, all that was left of the Jersey Devil's birthplace. It was here that she recounted the typical Jersey Devil story, but Beck heard some details within it that he could possibly track down and verify. He hit a few dead ends, but eventually he found a newspaper clipping from 1905, titled, quote, "On the Trail of Leeds Devil, the Dread Monster of Jersey's Big Forest." This telling took place in Burlington, on the Delaware River in 1735. The Mrs. Leeds of this story was a witch that had gotten pregnant. At first, the father is unidentified, though it's later confirmed to be the devil himself, or Old Horny, as he was unfortunately called in this paper. The rest of the story continues on as we know it, though it does have the lovely detail that its first meal was a few sleeping babies on its way to the Barrens. A very specific rendition says that although Mrs. Leeds was a Quaker, there were rumors that she'd indulged in sorcery. This expands back out, becoming an explanation for why there were so many midwives or helpers in attendance for the birth. They were all technically there to assist, but the high number of them was due to their curiosity. One newspaper article claimed that she was an old witch who'd fled Salem, but was cursed, or blessed, depending on your opinion, with eternal youth, as well as the ability to shapeshift. When it comes to how Mrs. Leeds reacts to her pregnancy, there are usually two ways that it goes. She either says, quote, "Let it be a devil," in a goodness gracious, here we go again kind of way, or, more commonly, she says something along the lines of, quote, "I'm tired of children, let it be a devil." These are two very different tones, one being a joke with a mildly annoyed note, the other a blatant show of disgust for the child. We'll get into more about the implications of the more aggressive attitude later, but just keep it in mind. When it comes to the newborn itself, I've only seen one or two adaptations where the child is already born a monster. Most renditions have the baby as being born a perfectly average human, before some form of evil descends upon it to pull and twist it into a devil. I think this implies that the child would have been a normal human child if only the mother hadn't decided to test God or fate. When it comes to witnesses, sometimes the midwives and assistants are accompanied by the Jersey Devil's older siblings. Still other versions have the children come spilling into the room after hearing the midwife's screams. This allows the devil to beat, or even kill them all, before fleeing. But sometimes the Jersey Devil doesn't hurt anyone at all. It just flies out the window or chimney without killing or maiming the onlookers or its mother, though usually the devil at least beats the crap out of those present. A few iterations say that the Jersey Devil specifically kills Mrs. Leeds, particularly in stories where Mrs. Leeds doesn't want her unborn child. A few times I read that the Jersey Devil even devours a few of the bystanders before taking its leave. Specifically, a rendition or two says that the Jersey Devil's entire family served as its first meal. Or sometimes it hunts down the local children on its first night in this world, though any interpretation where the Jersey Devil actually eats someone is rare. I'd say about a third of the stories document that the Jersey Devil didn't escape at all that night. In these cases, the devil is kept by the family as a kind of monstrous secret. I can only assume in these versions that the midwives were beaten to death on the first night. Otherwise, I don't think this secret would have been kept for very long. Mother Leeds confines her child in the attic or cellar, taking care of it for a number of years until it escapes during a raging storm. Even if the Jersey Devil does manage to belatedly escape, it usually then comes home every now and then to visit its mother. In a surprisingly sweet rendition, he returns to check that his mother's doing well, even bringing her presents. Alfred Heston's book Jersey Wagon Jaunts said that the Jersey Devil visited his mother every day, sitting on his favorite part of their yard's fence, like a cartoonishly monstrous bird. While adorable in my opinion, this iteration doesn't contain a loving mother. Mrs. Leeds is too afraid to feed her incredibly bizarre baby. She stays in the house, shooing at it from the doorway or window. Eventually, the poor creature gets the message and never returns. Personally, I hope there's a variation that combines the loving mother and this incredibly unique child, where this strange, malformed creature is loved and yet free. In any case, a darker story from Atlantic City, then known as Absecon Island, went that Mrs. Leeds gave birth to a, quote, misshapen devil child who roamed about the house. It was described as being evil incarnate, viciously attacking anyone who went near it, family or not. Eventually, a window was accidentally left open, and the child fled to the sand dunes. This story has the rare detail that the family tried very hard to recapture their meandering, violent sibling, but never managed to catch him. Eventually giving up on that entirely, Mrs. Leeds would go to the dunes every day to feed her evil child, returning home bleeding, clothes torn from the claws of her vicious offspring. Though her family begged her not to put herself in harm's way, she refused to abandon her youngest son. This dedication is incredibly rare in the origin stories of the Jersey Devil, as many express that Mrs. Leeds never wanted the child in the first place and was glad to be rid of it. That is, if she survived the birth and its escape. A strange outlier story comes from Peggy Dorsey of Ocean City, recorded in McCloy's book, Phantom of the Pines. The mother had been weakened from repeated childbirths, eventually afflicted with failing eyesight. When her last child was born deformed, she didn't confine the child because, due to that weak eyesight, she literally saw nothing wrong. However, over time, the young child's movements felt strange. The little blue coat he wore soon reminded her of bat wings. She eventually concluded that her youngest son was different from her other children. She continued to care for him, but started to lock him in the attic or cellar. One stormy night, 4 to 20 years after his birth, the winds blew open the cellar doors, or the attic window, or maybe the devil really did just fly up the chimney after all. Have you noticed a significant absence so far? It takes two to tango, and where exactly is Mrs. Leeds' dancing partner? Well, Mr. Leeds is almost never mentioned. Remember how one version says that the Leeds children ran in to see what's causing all the screaming, and the Jersey Devil kills them? Yeah, occasionally Mr. Leeds is included in that group. Why he wasn't in the room for the birth of his own child is unknown. One variant from Schlosser's book, Spooky New Jersey, has more detail about Mr. Leeds than anywhere else I've found. And unfortunately, all of that detail describes nothing good. Father Leeds is an outright abusive husband, drinking away any money that Mrs. Leeds manages to bring in. When the money was again walking its way to the bar, Mrs. Leeds knuckles down and works even harder, sewing to bring in any money to buy her 12 children shoes. She fears her husband, constantly trying to keep his violence away from their children and herself. However, the news of a 13th child snaps something inside of her. She delivers the news after he stumbles through the door, drunk, again. Quote, "A curse be on you, for your indolence and your sloth and your abusive ways. May a curse be on this child too. May it be a devil to plague you for your sins." Their argument moves out into the yard. Mr. Leeds takes a swing at his pregnant wife, but he's so drunk that he lands in the water trough. She screams loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Quote, "This child will be a devil. 13th child, devil's child. And it will come for you first." This apparently scares the cowardly excuse of a man. He stumbles out of the trough, fleeing from her rage, never again to be seen in the Pinelands. Her eldest child stands in the doorway and asks his mother if the last child really would be a devil. She tells him, quote, "Yes, my son, and you must take your brothers and sisters far away when it is born, or you will suffer the same fate as your father." I interpret this to mean that their future demon child would be one born of its parents' rage. Mrs. Leeds knows that this monster would lash out, as its father had, and wants her other children to be as far from danger as possible. The neighbors spread the gossip of this fight to the rest of the town. The people who'd never done anything about the deplorable Mr. Leeds begin to shun Mrs. Leeds. Many fear the threat she'd screamed at her husband, that perhaps she was a witch. The town's minister asks her if she has any sins that she needs to confess to him. She smiles as she caresses her stomach. No. But here's the thing. This is the only story where the women of the town actually stand up for Mrs. Leeds, as they know the truth of the life she led, and refuse to ignore that this mother did what she had to. They were the only ones willing to hold Mr. Leeds accountable and give any kind of sympathy or empathy to Mrs. Leeds. However, there are still some women who arrive, quote, more out of curiosity than goodwill to the side of the birthing bed. Even with these infuriating looky-loos present, no one really believes she'll birth a devil. She goes to church every Sunday. Quote, it was a relief, and to some a disappointment, when the baby was born completely normal. The midwife cleans and swaddles the child, reaching forward to hand the baby to its mother, only to scream and drop the bundle to the floor. The women all gasp, but Mother Leeds simply watches, expressionless. The child transforms, cat eyes now staring at the horrified crowd. The smarter women get the hell out of there. Those who remain are beaten with the beast's tail, and even Mrs. Leeds isn't spared this treatment. Weak from blood loss, along with this most recent thrashing, she gestures towards the chimney. Quote, you know what you must do. Out flies her newborn. When the women had recovered enough to look around the room, Mother Leeds lay dead beside the chimney. There was a look of peace on her face that the women in the room did not share, for they knew that she had unleashed a devil upon them all. In a satisfying twist, Mr. Leeds doesn't get away with years of abuse to his family. He's, predictably, the first victim of his youngest son. The next are any of the children who had decided to take local jobs instead of fleeing the town as their mother had told them to. This is the only version of the story where Mr. Leeds is described at all, especially anything beyond just vaguely existing in the wings. Other than this exception, the cursing, the birth, and occasional subsequent care all fall on Mrs. Leeds. We'll discuss why this is significant later on, as all versions of the Jersey Devil's birth is put disproportionately on one person's shoulders. Let's look at some very different stories. You'll recognize some of the bare bones, but these have changes that are significant enough that they need to be given their own time. Social reformer Jane Addams founded the Hull House in 1889, which was a real Chicago immigrant settlement house. Addams told the following story in a number of publications, specifying that one version was the, quote, Italian version, and the other was the, quote, Jewish version. We'll start with the Italian version. The Italian story starts when a pious Italian girl marries an atheist with anger issues. Not a great start. One day, her husband sees a, quote, holy picture that his wife had hung on their bedroom wall. He rips it off the wall in a rage, screaming that he'd sooner have the devil in his house than these relics of a false religion. Was it God or the devil himself that blessed them with their first child? Who can say? Though at this point, the story takes a comedic and abrupt turn. Apparently, as soon as this devil baby is born, it sprints at its father on its tiny chubby legs, shaking its finger at the man. The father eventually catches the child and, shaking in fear, brings it to the Hull House to be rid of this dreadful symbol of accountability. After all, it takes a special kind of man to be able to brave a newborn baby aggressively pointing at him. What Addams claimed was the, quote, Jewish version had only one real change from the Italian version. You see, the married pair already had 6 daughters by the time the story occurs. When the mother announces her 7th pregnancy, the father sneers at her that he'd rather have a devil than another girl. Be careful what you wish for, asshole. Well, in either version, Italian or Jewish, the devil child ends up at Hull House. Naturally, this didn't exactly stay hush-hush. According to Adams, people started to show up at Hull House, demanding to see the devil baby. The source where I got this information doesn't go any further to say if Adams paraded the child to the public or kept it in solitude. However, Hull House itself has a long history of hauntings and odd events, so I might have to take a deeper look at that house later. In Evesham, New Jersey, 1887, a young woman was about to give birth. This Mrs. Leeds was a local girl from a good family, quote, but of dubious decorum. She enjoyed attending parties and husking bees and other merriments more than the duties of married life. I went looking for what husking bees was, assuming that it must be something salacious. As it turns out, husking corn was a vital task that needed to be done in the autumn before winter. With how much corn was grown, this could be an intimidatingly large, yet tedious task. So they'd have husking parties, or husking bee, where family and friends would make an event out of it, so that the task would get done in the most pain-free way possible. These became an event that people looked forward to, almost like a sort of fall festival. It sounds like the young Mrs. Leeds liked to be social and vaguely independent, which, sure, was definitely a crime in the late 1800s for a woman. And this story certainly doubles down on her nefarious ways. When young Mrs. Leeds finds that she's pregnant, she apparently becomes a nightmare to her poor husband. They don't specify how, only that she, quote, made her husband's life difficult. The final nail in the coffin is during the labor she screams, quote, "Oh, let it be a devil." I feel like there's been many worse things said during one of the most painful experiences possible, but this sentence was apparently enough to morph her child into a monster, which then shot up the chimney and into the woods. An interesting detail is that someone happened to have a gun on them in the delivery room loaded with silver bullets. Unfortunately, those silver bullets had no effect on the creature. On to the next. This iteration says that the Jersey Devil is the result of the Leeds' mistreating a minister or clergyman. Folklorist John McPhee specifically recounts where a preacher cursed Mrs. Leeds because she rejected his attempts at converting her to his religion, the curse manifesting as the Jersey Devil. Despite many iterations of this plotline trying very hard to persuade the audience that the Leedses are aggressive, godless heathens, McPhee's version has the couple caring for the child over the course of 4 years. Although they try their best to love the child, the Jersey Devil kills them both, fleeing into the Barrens. Another take on the clergyman story is one where a Protestant clergyman hears that the Leeds family doesn't go to church. In this book, Mrs. Leeds simply rejects the clergyman's attempts at a conversation. Not wanting to talk to him was apparently enough to curse a child to be a monster. An odd side version is that a door-to-door salesman is offering Sacred Heart of Jesus portraits. A, quote, violently anti-Catholic woman shouted at him that she would rather have a devil in her house than one of these icons. Say no more, I guess. Now we explore a bit of a change in terms of the general perpetrator. Around 1850, a passing Romani asks a young South Jersey girl for food. It's unknown if the girl simply had no food or didn't want to provide any to the vagrant, but either way, she declines. This is enough for the traveler to inflict a, quote, gypsy curse. The rest of the story is generally the same, except the monstrous baby gets its name from its favorite hangout, Leeds Point. Instead of a, quote, gypsy curse, this next rendition places us in the American Revolution. The Battle of Chestnut Neck took place in October of 1778 near modern-day Port Republic. The future mother falls in love with a British soldier, though sometimes it's a Hessian. one of the German soldiers hired by the British to fight in the Revolution. The townsfolk reject the girl, cursing her as a traitor. We don't know anything about the fate of that soldier, what happens to the child, or really anything else. The map marking where this monstrous birth occurred is all over the place. Evesham Township, Southampton Township, Absecon Island, Estelleville, Pleasantville, Freehold, Vienna, and more. Far from the attitudes around its birth, everybody in hindsight seems to want to claim the Jersey Devil for their own. Despite this very odd competition, Burlington and Leeds Point have been the most frequently cited birthplaces. Naturally, people began to spring up, claiming to have intimate knowledge of this monstrous birth and the family attached to it. In 1887, Mrs. McCormick of Goshen, Cape May County, who was 84 at the time of her story, claimed that she personally knew Mrs. Leeds, and that the mother herself and the attending nurse had told her all about it. Folklorist Reverend Beck was informed by Mrs. Georgiana Blake of Pleasantville that the Jersey Devil had not one, not two, but 3 birthplaces. Not only that, but for most of these locations, Mrs. Blake even had an address. One was Leeds Point, another being Estelleville, and the last being a house that stood on the site of 507 South Main Street, Pleasantville, which had been owned by a Dr. Reich at the time. This Mrs. Blake also claimed that the Jersey Devil reappears every 7 years, always taking the role as a harbinger of evil. Mrs. Underhill of Lower Bank insisted that the Jersey Devil was born along the Mullica River, the child of Jane Leeds Johnson and Jake Johnson. Mrs. Underhill said, quote, "People down here say they have often seen him running along the rail fence between our house and the fields towards Leeds Lane and the old Leeds house." No matter which version of this story, no matter who lives or who dies, in the Leeds family or their assistants, one thing is for certain. There was a monster on the loose in the Pine Barrens. You might be getting a little miffed with my storytelling, because what on earth does this monster even look like? Well, there's actually a reason why I've waited this long to even describe our titular monster. What it looks like changes even more than its origin story. As a taste of how much this creature varies in its appearance, the creature can range from 18 inches to 20 feet tall. The DC newspaper The Evening Star wrote of it, quote, "It is described as a cross between a Shetland pony, a Newfoundland dog, and an ostrich, with some of the characteristics of a vampire bat and an albatross thrown in." This should tell you what a mess this monster is, so much so that we have to separately describe each body part of this thing. The head is most frequently described as a horse or cow's head, with or without goat horns. I also found that it can have a donkey's head, but with a dog's nose and teeth. Every once in a while, there's a report that it has a dog's head. Its gums are rotting, creating breath so fetid that it can curdle milk, blight crops, poison rivers and lakes, and kill all of the fish within them. A few believe that this is taken even further, that the Jersey Devil can breathe fire out of its nose or mouth. Its eyes are red or yellow, frequently glowing, sometimes specified as cat's eyes. Descriptions of the body are confusing. The base of the monster kind of sets the shape and size that the rest of its body parts can take. Usually the body's descriptions are pretty direct, such as a horse's or a deer's body. Occasionally, this downsizes to a dog's body. Bizarrely, some of the most common iterations are of the monster having a kangaroo's body. Very rarely does it have any human body parts at all. But then it ventures into a more vague direction, like a dragon's body or a, quote, snake-like body. Trying to combine these last two descriptions with the rest of the variety of body parts that it can have is truly a kind of mental gymnastics. oddly, I don't see many specifics on the front legs of the creature, or what animal they may be from. However, they are consistently described as being short and stumpy, as the creature is almost always bipedal. At the end of these shrimpy little arms are either cloven hooves or claws, specifically eagle or bear claws. Now, the hind legs can go one of two ways. Most commonly, they're thick and muscular, very kangaroo-like. More rarely, the legs are thin and spindly, like a crane's. The feet at the end of these legs are always a pig's or some other kind of cloven hoof. Interestingly, no matter the creature's size, even at 20 feet tall, the footprints are routinely close to 3 inches long by 2 inches wide. Every now and then, the prints show some kind of deformity. But that's not all. Remember how the Jersey Devil flew out of a window or up the chimney? That's right, this thing's got wings. The wings are always leathery and bat-like, but they're also comedically small. One source says that when fully stretched, they only get to 26 inches across. So just over 2-foot wide wings are said to lift this horse kangaroo thing off the ground. To put this into perspective, if a person was to grow wings, quite a few theories say that those wings would have to be 20 feet wide or longer. So yeah, I can't claim to know how this thing works, but it sounds pretty ridiculous. The last physical trait is a long tail. A decent number of reports say that it has a devil's tail, with 3 pointed spikes. Sometimes this is downgraded to a forked tail. And every now and then, it even has a tail tipped with a tuft of fur, like a lion, which sounds a little mortifying on the Jersey Devil's part. These crazy visuals eventually earned the Jersey Devil other names. The Jabberwock, Kangaroo Horse, Flying Death, King-a-Wing, Woozlebug, Flying Horse, Cowbird, Flying Hoof, Prehistoric Lizard, and more. But this monster wasn't looking to fade into the background, if that was even possible. Far from it. Counter to some of its origin stories where its family tries to conceal their horrible child, as an adult cryptid, it almost seems desperate to prove its presence. But the malevolence of its behavior varies quite a bit. On the more mild side, if it's bored, it swoops around and screams to spook farmers. If he needs to stretch his wings, it can be spotted gliding along the coast. Every once in a while, he decides to treat the neighborhood to a wailing lament, sitting on a chimney or roof and screaming some more. If he feels particularly mischievous, he'll press his flat nose against a window pane, glaring inside at terrified residents. If it steps up its game, it participates in some of the activities we've mentioned, like how its rotting breath can curdle milk, kill crops, and poison water sources. Though sometimes it was a little more lenient, only searing the corn as it passes by. When it gets hungry, local belief holds that it swoops down on the swamps and streams, boiling the water with its breath. The dead fish conveniently pop onto the surface. So, not great news for locals in general, but nothing besides a few fish are hurt, maimed, or dead. So let's jump to that level. There are countless stories of the Jersey Devil raiding chicken coops, destroying crops, and killing livestock, specifically chickens, pigs, goats, sheep, and even the occasional passing raccoon or dog. This is certainly much more problematic and frightening, eliminating tenuous sources of money for the already strained locals. A specific story says that he killed and ate a Rottweiler dog guarding a henhouse. Then there's the belief that he gobbled up some babies before he reached the depths of the Pine Barrens on his first night of life. Not to mention the midwives that a few of the origin stories say he devoured. Sometimes the beast is spotted along the shore of Bernagat Bay, laughing at sinking ships. This evolved to mean that if the devil is spotted on a shoreline, that one of the passing boats is doomed to sink. But there's also the other direction. Believe it or not, most residents believe that the Jersey Devil's never killed anyone, not even his family. Occasionally, people say he's even a herbivore. A New Jersey forest ranger reported that this belief was so strong in Burlington County that, quote, campers used to leave shoes outside of their tents at night so that the Jersey Devil would realize that beings and not plants were inside the tents. And if he is, in fact, a vegetarian, then he'd also be absolved of those animal mutilations. A few locals believe that he particularly enjoys curly grass fern, lentil blueberries, and even deviled clams. Quote, the fact that the creature has a sweet tooth was circulated after a number of pies left cooling on windowsills disappeared. Needless to say, many believe that the Jersey Devil has never attacked anyone, just caused a commotion or two. And funnily, that same forest ranger says that the Jersey Devil is most likely to be spotted on a full moon. Aside from being a fan of ambiance, he also seems to have a particular fondness for Halloween. So much of the intensive behavior, like crop damage and livestock deaths, definitely sounds like a way to find a scapegoat to blame for already stressed conditions. But the belief that the Jersey Devil is just kind of an ugly duckling wandering around the Barrens, taking in the scenery of the coast, and visiting some strange companions is a lot more common than the belief in a bloodthirsty monster, particularly in the present day. We'll be walking through quite a few encounters and sightings, but this is a fairly good summary in general of its reputation. The frequency of the sightings and legend inadvertently created folk rituals and habits to ward off the monster of the pines. Renard Wiseman of New Gretna recommended throwing salt and pepper around the house, as the pepper would make the Jersey Devil sneeze, and he simply doesn't seem to like salt. I generally hypothesize that maybe this has something to do with the very long history of belief in salt's ability to dispel evil, but I'd have to dig into that more. It's also said that the best protection from the Jersey Devil while traveling is to carry a small bag of onions around your neck. Onions have their own history with folk medicine and belief, so this may be an expansion of that. One of the quirkiest folk beliefs that became very popular, though I'm unsure how common it is now for very obvious reasons, is that the only sanctuary from the Jersey Devil is inside of an outhouse. Apparently, the devil won't pass through the half moon cut in the door. The reason why this would work has eluded me. But the Jersey Devil is one of the few cryptids that seeks out a variety of companionship. Around 1870, he befriended a beautiful, golden-haired girl dressed in white, creatively named the Golden-Haired Girl. The book Phantom of the Pines has a specific story for this mystery girl. The young woman was from Manasquan, betrothed to a handsome ship officer, but he had to make one last voyage before they could marry. Just before his last trip, the couple argued bitterly. Once he'd left, the girl realized that it would be a long time before they would see each other again, so she ran down to the docks to apologize, but by then she was too late. The mast disappeared over the horizon. The girl counted down the days until her fiancé would return. The day finally came, and she again ran down to the docks to meet him, but days passed, and the ship never appeared on the horizon. Weeks, months, years, nothing. The girl grew older, but she never moved on. When she passed away, her spirit continued searching for her certainly dead fiancé. So now the golden-haired girl in white wanders the Jersey coast, eternally looking east. But sometimes, the Jersey Devil appears to lend its support and companionship to the heartbroken woman. According to legend, this spirit may ask you if you've seen her lover. Telling her no could get you 20 years of bad luck. Another friend of the Jersey Devil is the disembodied spirit of a headless sailor whose ship wrecked on the Cape May County shore hundreds of years ago. A good portion of locals believe that this sailor was actually a pirate killed by Captain Kidd himself. Apparently, Kidd and his crew had buried a chest of gold, then slaying one of the crew so that his ghost would be forced to guard the chest. Seeing as Captain Kidd was executed in 1701, there isn't exactly anyone to testify to this story. Much like the golden-haired girl, the Jersey Devil eventually became friends with this headless specter, patrolling the beaches, marshes, and woodlands of southern New Jersey to keep him company. Every now and then, the pirate is seen with his head. How kind of Captain Kidd to only murder him in this version. But who doesn't want a pet or animal companion? Sometimes the Jersey Devil wanders the Bernagat Bay with a large black dog. Quote, in much of folklore, black dogs are considered to be symbols of satanic forces, and this particular black dog blends pirate and satanic associations. The story goes that pirates attacked and sank a ship off of Absecon Island, or present-day Atlantic City. The crew fought their way to shore, staggering onto the sand, only to be slaughtered by the pirates. Unfortunately, a cabin boy and his pet black dog were among these innocents. While the cabin boy disappears from this tale, the black dog made its way back to Bernagat Bay, where it's occasionally seen bounding through the marshes, side by side with the Jersey Devil. The final companion is similar to the golden-haired girl, except this time, it's a mermaid that lives in the bay. She'll make a trip onto the rocks every now and then and can be seen playing a harp as the Devil of the Pines sits by her side. Not only does the Jersey Devil have a variety of friends, but he also seems to need a change of scenery once in a while. And then there's the debate of where his true home within the Barrens is. Reverend and author Henry Beck wrote of a story from the 1930s called The Blue Hole. You see, not far from the intersection of the Great Egg Harbor River and Piney Hollow Road sits the 130-foot-wide Blue Hole. According to local lore, the pool is bottomless, serving as the home for the Jersey Devil. Although the water looks incredibly inviting, if you're foolish enough to swim its waters, the devil will reach up and pull you into the abyss. Remember that there are a good deal of pools, small lakes, and other waterways in the Barrens. As a side note, there are multiple pools called blue holes, but the one we just mentioned is considered the blue hole. The story is that the Jersey Devil has found connecting channels from pool to pool, swimming to and from lake to pond wherever he wishes. Or, if you want the most dramatic theory, the pools serve as gateways, the blue hole specifically being a bottomless portal to, where else? Hell. Today there are signs warning tourists and locals against swimming in the holes. The 2020 documentary, The Jersey Devil, Monster in the Pines, interviewed the Down Township fire chief and lead rescue diver, Cliff Higbee. Higbee says,
our dive team over the past 25, 30 years have had approximately 50 body recoveries, and the majority of them are from the blue holes. A lot of the victims that we have recovered over the years weren't necessarily bad swimmers. A lot of them were actually, we were told, were good swimmers. There's a lot of mystique or folklore about the blue holes, and some say it's the Jersey Devil that may attract people to these areas. We try to educate people not to go to these places, but it's almost like a magnet.
A structure dating back to the 1730s has earned the name the Witch's Well by locals. This is an old pump house in Mount Holly of Burlington County. According to Pine Barrens guide Rob Locks, a witch lured the Jersey Devil into the well, both becoming trapped at the bottom. The townsfolk then supposedly built the structure over the well to contain them both. Other than serving as a kind of spooky teen hangout spot, I haven't found much else about it. The last commonly claimed location is the Bodine Tavern. Don't bother trying to find its website because the business is well buried under gnarled roots. It opened in 1769 near the Wading River, and the Jersey Devil began to make regular visits to sit on their roof. These sightings became so common that in the early 1800s, the tavern started to print the Jersey Devil onto their cider jugs. Unfortunately, the tavern suffered the same fate as many businesses and families once the ironworks started to fade by the 1840s. Despite the tavern closing, the devil is supposedly spotted in the area to this day. The Jersey Devil may be popular now, but by the middle of the 19th century, the Leeds family homestead was steadily trickling out of the public's consciousness. The only people who really remembered the faint silhouette of the monster in the Barrens were the locals. But the once busy and booming cultural towns had evolved. Quote, "Some saw the thick forests as home to stereotypical, dull-witted bumpkins, wary of outsiders and none too friendly. The Jersey Devil legend gets a good bit of its steam from this perception of the Pineys as ragged, near savages, engaged in who knows what in their darkened lairs and rude hovels. Such a location made for an admirable place to birth a monster." Despite the dip in knowledge of the Jersey Devil, its memory remained alive in those locals, whether people looked down on them for their beliefs and lifestyles or not. And eventually, the number of encounters would be too great to ignore. Legend has it that after the birth of the Pine Barrens' own private monster, the sightings and antics got so bad that a notable clergyman was contacted. Author Charles Skinner writes that this particular clergyman, quote, "was secured who, by reason of his piety and exemplary life, had dominion over many of the fiends that plagued New Jersey, and had even prevailed in his congregation against Applejack, which some declared to be a worse fiend than any other, if, indeed, it did not create some of those others." In the 1740s, this man arrived with only a bell, a book, and a candle with him, exorcising the Jersey Devil. This exorcism was meant to last for 100 years. The devil was still occasionally spotted, but apparently it was less than before. Despite this, the locals grew more and more restless as the 1840s approached, because their ancestors had warned them to prepare themselves for the fading of the exorcism. And, true to the legend, the Jersey Devil reappeared in force on schedule. In 1776, the Jersey Devil started his tenacious reputation of being a portent of disaster, spotted several times in the Salem, Gloucester, and Cumberland counties, right before the Revolutionary War. October 1790, Vance Larner writes of an encounter with a Jersey Devil-like creature in his diary. Quote, "It was neither beast, nor man, nor spirit, but a hellish brew of all three. It was beside a pond where I came upon it. I stopped and did not move. Nay, I could not move. It was dashing its tail to and fro in the pond and rubbing its horns against a tree trunk. It was as large as a moose with leathery wings. It had cloven hooves as big around as an oak's trunk. After it was through with the tree, it yielded an awful scream as if it were a pained man, and then flew across the pond until I could see it no more." It should be noted that he doesn't call it the Jersey Devil because it wasn't widely known by that name until later. I wonder if this early of a report would go on to influence the belief that the Jersey Devil resides in these ponds. Larner doesn't say that it was diving into or lived in the pond, but still. Also, this deviates from the commonality that the Jersey Devil's feet are always tiny. In 1803, one of the most commonly recounted episodes of the Jersey Devil's folklore is that of Commodore Stephen Decatur. Stephen Decatur was an early 19th century American naval hero who had traveled to the Hanover Iron Works in the Pine Barrens. Being a no-nonsense military man, he'd come to make sure that the cannonballs being made for his battle against the Barbary Coast pirates were of good quality. While testing these cannons at a firing range, Decatur saw a strange creature flying across the range. What the hell, I guess. He took aim and fired at the Jersey Devil. All who were present saw this cannonball strike the devil clean, tear a gaping hole in it, and have no noticeable effect on the creature whatsoever. It continued to fly serenely away, barely noticing that anything had happened. In 1810, a farmer sees a, quote, winged deer eating wild berries. The former king of Spain and brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, Joseph Bonaparte, lived in Bordentown from 1816 to 1839. The ex-king loved to hunt deer in the forest, and supposedly encountered the monster while on a hunt. The book The Secret History of the Jersey Devil, which we'll reference heavily later on, points out that, quote, the two most famous people, these two being Commodore Stephen Decatur and Joseph Bonaparte, who allegedly encountered the Jersey Devil, left no letters or diaries detailing their experiences. It seems unlikely that they would have made no note of such a highly unusual experience. Despite this, these two incidents in particular would cling tenaciously to Jersey Devil lore. In 1840, the beast rampaged particularly rigorously, causing a heavy loss of chickens and sheep. The following year, the same happened, but now accompanied by odd footprints and chilling screams. In the fall of 1858, W.F. Mayer of New York encountered 50 unhoused locals who lived in tents, scraping a living from working at the cranberry bogs. One of these people was toothless, elderly Hannah Butler. She stared up at the storm forming over them, saying, quote, "I is there, and a storm like the one when I seed the Leeds Devil." A man at her side hushed her, telling her off for speaking of the creature, as she might summon it upon them. This was a common belief in the, quote, devil-ridden Barrens. Mayer would later write in an article for Atlantic Monthly that many of the residents did everything they could to not have to venture out after dark. From 1860 to 1861, the Jersey Devil is spotted several times, flying up and down the coast, believed to be warning people of the coming Civil War. In 1870, the Jersey Devil is seen taking a swim with his mermaid friend. In 1872 or 1873, a man named Daniel Conover shoots the Jersey Devil, predictably with no effect. During the 1880s, there were reports that complained that the Jersey Devil, quote, carried off anything that moved in the Pine Barrens. Heavy storms batter the coast in January of 1884, many locals believing that this meant that someone must have pissed off the Jersey Devil. In 1893, there was a little more excitement of the dramatic variety. An Erie railroad engineer claimed that his train had been attacked by the Jersey Devil, exclaiming that it had the face, quote, of an ape or monkey. Some suggested that he might have been startled by an owl, to which he snorted indignantly, quote, "Bah, that hain't no owl. That's the Leeds Devil. Back again, sure as you're livin'." 1898, the Jersey Devil is spotted as a forewarning of the Spanish-American War. An incident from 1899 was reported years later in the Rockland Independent. Businessman George Sorosi claimed that, quote, his sleep was disturbed for a number of nights by ungodly screams emanating from the vicinity of the Lawrence Street Bridge over the Pascack River in Spring Valley, New York. Sorosi spotted the perpetrator, which resembled a flying spirit. Some who had heard the story of the Jersey Devil recognized his description, while others speculated that it was a crane. Charles Montgomery Skinner wrote about the Jersey Devil in his book American Myths and Legends, published in 1903. He insisted that, though Mother Leeds disguised herself under the appearance of, quote, a sober Quaker, she was definitely a witch. He gave a lot of complimentary details to the brave Quaker clergymen who exorcised the Jersey Devil. But he also entirely ignored that Quakers don't do exorcisms. By the end, he's written that the Jersey Devil had become, quote, a grim tradition, and that it would, quote, soon be forgotten. This is where we'll leave off for this week. But I can promise you one thing, that Mr. Skinner was so incredibly wrong. You guys have to come back next week because things are about to get crazy. Just insane in a way I've never seen before. I honestly can't wait. But in the meantime, have a safe, exciting, and spooky Halloween.